In Proverbs 29:18, King James tells us, where there is no vision, the people perish. Well, guess what? The opposite is also true. Where there are no people, the vision perishes. Now, Jesus explained this dynamic in Matthew 9:37. He says, the harvest is plentiful. It's not a harvest problem, but the laborers are few. There's a labor shortage. The people are not there to do the work. Now, leaders might have a godly vision for reaching the harvest, but without the laborers, a ready harvest will remain unreached. The harvest will not be gathered. Now, Jesus instructed that we are to pray earnestly to the Lord of the harvest to send out laborers into his harvest. So, we'll need our knees on the floor, but we'll also need our boots on the ground, actively harvesting harvesters so that we can harvest the harvest. Now, to do so, we must effectively cast vision, and we must effectively create ownership of that vision. Well, what kind of vision are we talking about? We're talking about a Great Commission vision, a vision to go and make disciples. Well, casting Great Commission vision and creating Great Commission ownership requires us to lead people through change. When you consider the overwhelming percentage of U.S. churches that are in plateau and decline, you realize just how far from Great Commission or Great Commissional ministry we actually are. So the church must change the way it thinks about ministry. The church must change the way it does ministry. The church must change the way it resources ministry. Now, how many of you think church people love change? I'm sure you see the challenge. Consider this: change as choice versus change as crisis. It seems that it's a very rare church that simply chooses to change. More often, a church will wait until there's some crisis on hand before they'll consider changing. In other words, we only change if we have to. We never think about changing because we want to, because we choose to. The problem with that approach is that very often the church in crisis is in some state of weakness. Now, change is difficult enough when the church is healthy and vibrant, but when the church is struggling in plateau or decline, it makes it all that more difficult. So let's avoid the crisis and let's think about changing earlier rather than later. Now, when we think about change, let's think about 4 dimensions of change and 4 types of people. We'll start with 4 dimensions of change. Dimension number 1 is the willingness to change. We as leaders who are attempting to lead our churches through change are hoping that people will be willing to make the change. However, we need to understand that being willing is simply not enough. Willingness, sure, is something that we want. We don't want people to say they're not willing to change. But I've been in many situations where there were people who were legitimately willing to make the change. Only when the change arrived, they couldn't handle it. So on one hand, there is the willingness to change, but there's also a second dimension, the ability to change. Can people who think they'll be able to change actually change when the time comes? Willingness to change usually operates in a hypothetical environment. In other words, change is being considered, change is being talked about, people are being asked to get on board, and very often in a completely well-meaning way, people will say, yes, I understand it, I get it, I'll be on board. But the change comes and they just can't handle it. The ability to change is a very different thing than the willingness to change. And as leaders, we have to be aware of those two dimensions. Now, there's a third dimension of change. I call it the substance of change. And that has to do with what we're changing to. Change has two faces. One face of change is what are we changing from? The other face of change is what are we changing to? And I've learned over the years that changing from is much easier to navigate than changing to. You know, take this for example. You might have, say, 8 or 10 people on a team, on a committee that are considering change. Now, let's pick on music in the church, because that's such a hot button issue for lots of leaders in the church today. We might have, let's say we have a group of 10 who are examining the need to change the music approach or style of the church. And you might find that these 8 or 10 people are in unanimous agreement. All of them agree that there is a need to change from whatever it is that we're currently doing in the way of music ministry. But then you go to the other side of change and ask the question, okay, fine. If we're going to change from that, what are we going to change to? And there are 10 different perspectives as to what this new thing should look like. Changing from is much easier to navigate than changing to. Then there's a fourth dimension of change, the pace of change. How much change can a given congregation handle, and how fast can they handle it? Now, there is no right or wrong to this. There is no formula to figure this out. This is simply a matter of leaders knowing their people and also understanding the viability factors. There are churches that simply are not viable financially in particular. And so the clock is ticking, and they may not have 2 years to work this out. Maybe they have 6 months to work this out. So you've got this tension between how much change people can handle, how quickly, and what's the viability factor? How long can the church hold out while these changes are taking place? It's a very delicate, very difficult, very complicated issue. It's a matter for prayer. It's a matter of very diligent effort on the part of leaders to figure that out. You've got the willingness to change, the ability to change, the substance of change, and the pace of change. Well, let's talk about 4 types of people. Now, one thing I'd like you to note as we enter into this part of the discussion, we talk about leading a church through change, leading a congregation through change. But the truth is, that's a little misleading. It's really not that you lead a congregation through change as if the entire congregation in one fell swoop will make the change, each person simultaneous with every other person. It doesn't work that way. In fact, you don't really lead a congregation through change. You lead a person through change. One person, another person, another person, and then one day you realize, I think there are more people over here on our new approach than are now still back at our old way of doing things. But it's a gradual thing, and people don't move in lockstep. They don't stand as one man and move in unison. Each person is weighing this individually, and so you have to take stock of how individual people are wired. Now, human beings are very complex, and I don't mean to oversimplify that, but there are 4 types of people that I have generally seen in this interaction of moving people through change in a congregation. The first type I call theorist. Now, the theorist is someone who can understand something in its theoretical form. the idea of making this change makes sense to them. They don't need to experience, they don't need to see it any further. The concept of it just resonates with them. And so they are willing to commit just based on, let's call it, the theory of the change. Now, second type is the realist. Now, realists are people who are not going to respond to the theory. They're not going to respond to the idea. What they need to do is see it, experience, feel it. So again, if we're talking about something such as music, you might say to the theorist, we think we need to make some kind of switch in our approach to music. The theorist will say, great idea, I get it, I'm on board. The realist will say, what do you mean? What kind of change? What is that going to look like? What kind of music are you going to use? What personnel are going to be on the platform? Are we talking choirs and piano and organ, or are we talking a band? Are we talking a singer with a guitar? How loud is this going to be? What kind of music are you going to use? How long are these songs going to be? The realist is going to have to experience it multiple times before he or she is able to say yay or nay. Well, then we come to this third type of person, the pragmatist. The pragmatist is a person that's really not going to buy the theory, not even going to buy the reality. What the pragmatist is interested in is, does this work? Does this do what it's designed to do? So I'm going to sit back and watch this for a while and see if there's any fruit that develops from this. Now, one thing I hope you've noticed here is that there's a time lag here. The theorist can get on board early. The realist is going to require a little time to experience the changes that are coming. The pragmatist is going to need even more time because he or she is waiting for those early returns. So if you are expecting the realist or the pragmatist to get on board early just because leadership came up with a new idea, you're going to be very disappointed. And you're going to be asking people to do something that they simply can't do. And that's not fair. So have in mind the fact that there's going to be a time lag for some people to get on board. Well, that brings me to type number 4. The preservationist. Now, these are folks that are so married to whatever the conventional historical pattern has been, they are very likely not going to ever be ready to make this adjustment to something new. Now, people are more than just a temperament. So there are times when a preservationist will get on board for some reason other than temperament. So that is a possibility. But typically the preservationist wants to sort of dig in and hold to the traditions, hold to the conventions that have been part of the church or that denomination for some number of years. So as you're working with people, don't be surprised when not everyone jumps up at the first mention of a new idea and says, where do I sign up? You've got different people thinking different things. You have to understand that change is delicate. It's complicated. There are dimensions to change. There are different types of people. Leading people through change is delicate and complicated. Essentially, what we're trying to do through change is to bring people into alignment with the Great Commission vision, enabling them to understand it and to take ownership of it. Alignment should operate on two fronts. There is the public alignment of people and the private alignment of people. So let's look at public alignment. First of all, on the public front, we want to give this vision very high visibility. We want to make it known throughout the church. We want to be talking about it. We want to be making announcements. We want to be sending out newsletters or email blasts or whatever it is we need to do. It should be constantly part of the conversation. So we want to shine a very bright light on this Great Commission vision and give it very high visibility. Also, on the public alignment front, we want to provide repeated communication. We need to say these things again and again and again and again. I'll go so far as to say there's no such thing as too much communication. Now, those of us who might be in leadership in the church, particularly in the real core or center of leadership in the church, are thinking about these kinds of things all the time. If we're on staff, it's a 24/7 kind of preoccupation. Key lay leaders are thinking about these things all the time. But the average person in the church is not. And as you're talking about this vision, they might connect for the moment, but it's going to dissipate. So you have to reinforce, reinforce, reinforce. Repeated communication. Never think you've reached the point of saturation where everyone has heard it all the number of times they need to hear it so that they can make an informed decision. They're not living this vision the way that you might be. And so, again, repeat it, repeat it, repeat it, repeat it. So we've got high visibility and repeated communication. Now, also in the public arena of alignment, we don't want to be issuing ultimatums. We don't want to be having those kinds of, let's call them town hall meetings or large-scale celebrations or presentations where we get to the end and we're asking people to sign up. We want a show of hands, or we want people to walk to the front or sign some kind of card. We don't want to draw lines in the sand, asking people to step across those lines. It's just not a healthy practice in the public arena. It's logical. I understand it, but it just doesn't work. What happens in those situations is people are not fully informed. They haven't processed. They don't really have an opportunity to ask all the questions that they might want to ask. And so they're not really ready to commit. And when you call for commitment, you've put them on the spot. You know, either they've got to come and commit to something they're not really ready to commit to, or they've got to say no. And both sides of that are uncomfortable. Okay, so we want to avoid that large scale kind of line in the sand. Are you with us or are you not? Very, very dangerous. It can do a lot of damage to creating ownership of the vision. Let's think about private alignment. Now, in the private setting of the one-on-one conversation, the small group, the few people over coffee, that's really where the action is. Now, we need the public alignment. We need the high visibility. We need the repeated communication, not the ultimatums, not the call to commitment. This is just information and visibility. But in the private setting, that's where the action is. Casting vision, creating ownership, is more about conversation than presentation. It's the informal discussion in the parking lot. It's running into some folks at the back of the church after the worship service. That's where the action is. Close, personal, informal. That's when we have the opportunity to really hear from people. We think when we host the town hall meeting that we're giving everyone a chance to make comments and to ask questions. But in truth, we're not, because most people have a fear of public speaking. They will not comment in a large group. They will not ask a question in a large group. But one-on-one or in a very small, intimate group, they will talk for great lengths of time, and you'll walk away from those conversations really knowing where people stand. Conversation versus presentation. Now, in the private alignment setting, you want to use those opportunities to answer questions and remove obstacles. You know, what's holding a person back from making a commitment? A lot of times it's a misunderstanding or a lack of communication. And you can straighten those things out in that small, intimate setting. Now, it's in the private alignment that you have an opportunity to call folks to commitment. There is the opportunity for commitment. Are you ready to get on board with this? Well, if they are, yes. If not, they can simply say so, but they're not in the public square, so to speak. It's private, it's personal. And if they're not ready, they're not ready. Fine. Circle back and talk with that person again a month from now or whenever. The point is, we're not going to put people on the spot calling for a public commitment. We're going to spend time with people in the private setting until they're ready to commit. Now, this leads me to share a principle with you. I call this the divide and serve principle. Again, we don't want to call for commitment in the large public setting. We want to spread people out into small groups, into one-on-one kinds of interaction. And it's the divided congregation in a positive sense, the spread out congregation that we want to speak to. And we do much, much better when we divide things down to small common denominators and serve people intimately rather than these large-scale promotions from a platform. Now, here's another vital 180 for you. We're not going to use the large public gathering to sell the vision. We're going to use the large public gathering to celebrate the vision once people have ownership that has been engendered through private alignment. That's the way it really works. The big splash should come at the end of the vision casting process when folks have already committed, rather than at the beginning to try to draw them in. So we don't use the large public gathering to sell the vision. We use it to celebrate the vision once the majority of people are on board. Now, how important are casting vision and creating ownership? Well, remember, where there are no people, the vision will perish.